So once again, this is the day when the court system, the court bureaucracy, has been given the go-ahead to process evictions again. It's not evictions that the Daily Mirror is talking about tipping point in the fight against evictions and fight for the housing rights. Okay, today's Daily Mirror, tipping point on the fight against eviction is not there. And the disgrace applies equally to the culture of evictions. And what is happening is that the cabinet is not bothered about housing. And nor are the tabloids. One of the first things that the mainstream media refers to in connection with evictions is rent arrears. But they never have any ideas to what causes rent arrears and how rent arrears are invented and faked. In part B, we've been talking about Hrs community housing and the collusion between the DWP, Deprivation, Want and Poverty Creation Department, and the crook Steve Hill, in post in Tower Hamlets Council as the so-called benefits manager, and the corrupt behavior by the licensed law trader Edward Fitzpatrick, based at Garden Court Chambers in the Lincoln's Inn in London, central London, and the infant status solicitor, licensed law trader called Lucy Green. And all of these wrongdoers and criminals and liars were given the go-ahead to evict the tenant who had not done anything wrong. And this go-ahead was given by Henrietta Manners' co-conspirator and co-conspiratorial racist, co-conspiring racist liar, Judith Goodman. She was nothing to do with good. She was absolute badness and a bad person. So this is the actual evidential story about how they cause eviction, how they cause rent arrears, and how they cause pretexts, and how down the line, all the way from A to Z, every participant who is recognized by the likes of The Guardian and the Daily Mirror and others to be doing something to help the victim of the weapon of eviction. Eviction has nothing to do with rent arrears. Most rent arrears are not the reason why evictions are applied for. And none of the members of the court system, which is the county court level, is bothered about the rights or the wrongs of what is going on. It is a rubber stamping operation. And when it comes to the likes of Judith Goodman, it is worse than that. It is actually once in a lifetime opportunity for a racist like her to wreak revenge against the target of her racist hatred and contempt and illegality. So we'll be talking about All of that being absent from the media's coverage today. And what we have seen in the internet version of The Guardian, there is a piece by somebody called Peter Walker, said to be a The Guardian kind of linked person. And he has peddled a line that has talked about momentum, the Jeremy Corbyn linked momentum, which appears to be under new kind of management since Corbyn left. And there is a thing called London Renters Union. Now, those two are quoted, or persons allegedly connected with the new momentum and the London Renters Union. They're quoted in the stupidest possible way, because one of them is saying that they have been training their members. It is the London Renters Union. There is no clue what kind of training is going to stop evictions, because evictions are legitimized and legalized by rubber stamping courts, and there is no mention of any role whatsoever being played by the courts, the criminally active courts, the corruptly active courts, the dishonestly active courts, the racistly active courts, the illegally active courts. There is no mention in either the quoted text or in the general kind of text by this Peter Walker and The Guardian. And that actually is a measure of the dire absence of any action to stop this robbery of housing rights and stop this avalanche of evictions that has been given the go-ahead to be resumed with effect from today. There is nothing in sight from the so-called shelter organization and nothing from any other so-called anti-discrimination or anti-poverty creation outlets. So we'll be going back to what happened in Tower Hamlets community housing and Tower Hamlets councils employed benefits manager Steve Hill conspiring with the DWP to create a series of pretexts so that they could accuse the target of their attacks by possession applications of having not paid the rent. That is absolutely not true. That never happened. The rent was paid directly by Tower Hamlets Council to Tower Hamlets Community House. So therefore, there was no even kind of intervention or contact between the payment of the rent and the person they targeted on the alleged ground of rent arrears. Now, Tower Hamlets Community Housing is the second biggest gang of criminals. Of course, the main gang was personified by the so-called chief executive, who was a Tower Hamlets Council employee who was conspiring to create this housing stock transfer while he was in post in the Tower Hamlets Council. The housing stock transfer that created Tower Hamlets Community Housing. They're the second biggest recipient of the council housing stock from Tower Hamlets Council that happened under the corrupt initiative and pressure exerted by John Prescott, who was the cabinet minister at the time, allegedly for DEFRA, the department that actually has been succeeded by the Department of Housing in the years that followed. And the bigger one was the gang of crooks called Poplar Haque, which got many more council housing stock than the Tower Hamlets Community Housing. But Tower Hamlets Community Housing got enough housing stock for it to be able to abuse the tenants and residents and capitalize on this stock, which is what was going to happen when the council's control was removed. Not that the council itself was doing a very good job of providing good service, but as compared with the gang of crooks that were given the housing stock, the council regime was less oppressive and less negligent and less blasé. Think about all of this. This is part C of today's diagnosis of Fleet Street. That is to say, there is nothing in the Fleet Street papers today about the lack of housing rights and the robbery of housing rights and the exposing of hundreds of thousands of people, new people, victims of eviction, to the newly returning surge of the virus. Think about that. So this is Monday, the 21st of September 2020, and this is the third part of how evictions are far worse and far wider than only caused by rent arrears, and how the media, including The Guardian, are completely absent from journalism, from reporting the actual events and the facts of how the eviction nightmare is imposed on people and how criminally active decision makers are maliciously creating evictions, pretexts, and excuses. All of these factors are present in the behavior of Tower Hamlets Community Housing, Tower Hamlets Council's benefit section criminal, Steve Hill and his gang. And the context has to be also kind of assessed and evaluated by referring to the fact that in the same number of years since the Tower Hamlets Community Housing started the harassment of the particular tenant, and the harassment was begun by Michael Tyrrell, who in 1996 wrongly concluded that the racist kind of attack that had taken place on an estate in Bethnal Green by a gang of racists against a Bangladeshi family, targeting Bangladeshi family whose member, a male member called Dilwar, was attacked almost lethally. He nearly died in hospital. He was nearly killed by the stabbing. And when this campaign was organized against the racist attack, and the campaigner, the fronter of the campaign, was the person that Mike Tyrrell later targeted for evicting from Tower Hamlets Council's flat at that time. Mike Tyrrell, who was in post as a Tower Hamlets Council housing quote manager in the same area of the council, which is Bethnal Green South, Mike Tyrrell concluded that the attack took place innocently and that the campaign against the attack was targeted at him because the campaigners were saying that the council should make sure that people resident on the council estates are safe. Now, can you imagine, for such a campaign, the campaigners and the main campaigner was targeted by a Tower Hamlets Council employee who eventually succeeded in evicting the campaigner. And in doing that, he caused and contributed to causing damages that cannot be anything less than 6 or 7 billion pounds. Now that is how truly shocking and overwhelmingly negligent and ignorant the Fleet Street media is about the truth about what is going on in housing and in eviction, because they only use the two words, eviction and rent arrears or arrears. They don't talk about anything else. And even so, the today's papers, the website so far meaning it is 3:25 in the afternoon in UK time and 2:25 in the afternoon GMT in the afternoon on Monday, the 21st of September 2020. This is the day when the housing minister has lifted the ban on eviction proceedings. And so therefore there is a go-ahead given to the evictors to target their targets and have a season of evictions. And that season is doubly dangerous because the virus is now on the return, on the upsurge again. So a lot of people, thousands of people will be being exposed to the virus, and their safety and their health and their lives would be at risk. So it is logical to ask the question in this context today, topically and contextually and on the basis of the facts, what is Keir Starmer doing about stopping this kind of attacks and violence and violation? The answer is no, none, nothing. Starmer is not doing anything, he's not saying anything. Nor is the housing shadow minister, Thangam Debonair, who is the MP for Bristol West and is the occupant in the post of the shadow minister for housing. She's not doing anything, she's not saying anything. There is no evidence of her saying anything in the piece that Peter Walker incompetently published by including only the new momentum and the spokesperson from the London Renters Union. So the whole history will never be told by the mainstream media or any of the media. So this is why this particular channel and this broadcast and the broadcasting program and campaign is built on and is delivering world exclusive factual reports from the very front line of the campaign and very front line of the engagement against the criminals in places of making decisions that the places on the outside apparently are not criminals, but they are doing crimes as defined by mens rea and actus reus, intention of malice and the actual carrying out of the maliciously intended wrong thing against innocent parties. That is what the use of the term criminal is about in this context and in this broadcast. So, Michael Tyrrell, in July 1996, attended a meeting held in the Bethnal Green North area where the estate was, where Dilwar the boy was attacked and almost killed by a gang of racists in the neighborhood, in the pub or in the neighborhood. And the public meeting was addressed strongly by the campaign organizer. And the campaign organizer blamed the Tower Hamlets Council for allowing that kind of racist atmosphere to prevail on its estate, housing estate. And Mike Tyrrell concluded that it was a campaign aimed against him. Regardless of what was said about his denial at that meeting, which was rebutted for evidential reasons, that campaign was never and could never have been organized about him. That remained the case and remains the case now. So it's 1996 July, and this is now what? Total 14 years plus 2 months. So 14 years and 2 months, and the Tower Hamlets community housing is still in denial. Now, The person that Michael Tyrrell targeted for eviction was being repeatedly targeted for eviction and repeatedly harassed with eviction notices. Even before Tower Hamlets Council took over the property as part of the transfer of council housing stock. That happened about between 2005 and 2006. Now, the other thing that has to be said to explain to people who are not familiar with Tower Hamlets or the various bureaucratic outfits that operate in local councils and through local councils and the various bureaucratic interconnections between central government departments and housing associations like the Tower Hamlets Community Housing. The gangsters outfit is classified as a housing association. And the central government departments like the Department for Deprivation, Want and Poverty Creation, which is the one that issues the money under the benefit scheme, which is for helping the persons in low income pay the rent under the scheme for rent rebate or housing benefit. So it's the central government DWP, local Tower Hamlets Council who administers the housing benefit or supposed to administer the housing benefit. But in this case, Tower Hamlets Council housing benefit manager behaved as a criminal, as an offender, as a wrongdoer, as a violator of the law, as a breaker of the obligation to pay the rent for the particular target of the serial attacks by eviction proceedings. So the DWP, Central Government Department for Want and Poverty Creation, the local council misrepresented by the criminal in post, Steve Hill, the housing association that took over the control from Tower Hamlets Council of the council housing stock that included this particular flat. So, and their fronter, Michael the crook, the racist criminal, Tyrrell. So it's the DWP, number of criminals operating there in contact with the racist liar, Steve Hill, and Mike Tyrrell was in contact with Steve Hill. Now, Mike Tyrrell was in contact with Steve Hill, not necessarily always personally, but he was in contact with a woman employed in that THCH at the time, Carol Thomas. So these are the ones that were creating the pretext for the housing for the rent arrears. There never was a rent arrears because the target of the claim under rent arrears had already been owed nearly £2,000 by Tower Hamlets Community Housing about the target having averted a previous attempt at evicting them. So that happened in 2006. Within months of THCH taking full control of the property, they started the eviction process against this particular target. So that was symptomatic, clear evidence of Michael Tyrrell having resumed 10 years on his original plan to evict the person that was conveyed to Colin Cormack and Keith Brown, two of the employees in Tower Hamlets Council's generally housing department, housing section in 1996. So Tyrrell waited for or was active for 10 years until he found the opportunity and conspired with Steve Hill and the DWP to create a pretext of there being a rent arrears. There never was. And the woman who was in direct contact with the target at that time was Carol Thomas. So the Carol Thomas spoke to the target on the Friday before the Monday when the hearing took place at Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court. And in that conversation, the target said everything that had been said before, that this was a lie, this was absolutely untrue, unjust, and unjustified, unfounded, and so on. And I'm not going to accept any of it, and I'm going to tell the court everything about what constitutes the wrongness of this attack. And accordingly, the conversation ended with a statement by the claimant, THCH, and the targeted tenant, that the tenant would send the communications to the court, which they did. So when the hearing so-called took place, it was held according to the understanding by the tenant that their communications sent by email would constitute enough response to the claim. Remember, that was the basis, not because they neglected. They accepted the court's rule, the civil procedure rules about communications, that email communications are accepted. So they gave all the reasons, all the explanations, and updated their rejection of the possession order and condemned the THCH as liars, and expected the court to take into account all of that. Did the court take into account all of that? On the result of that ruling, the court, which was chaired or presided over by the hearing that was processed by the racist liar Henrietta Manners, obviously was hostile to the tenant, regardless of the quality and the substance of their refutation of the application. So she gave an order granting the application for eviction to Tower Hamlets Community Housing. So when that order was made, the tenant learned about it and he rejected that order, and he applied for a hearing of an appeal. And the hearing of the appeal was messed up by another racist called Judith Goodman, who was a co-conspirator with Henrietta Manners. And they conspired to sabotage the appeal. And the sabotage was aided and abetted and made possible by the racist incompetence and ignorance by the licensed law trader Edward Fitzpatrick from the Garden Court chambers based at the Lincoln's Inn. And he was wrongly instructed, allegedly on behalf of the tenant, by the infantile, stupid and ignorant licensed law trading solicitor called Lucy Green. And this was made worse by the lying uttered by the barrister who appeared in court on behalf of the Tower Hamlets Community Housing. And Carol Thomas lied as well when she appeared during the hearing of the appeal. And Edward Fitzpatrick lied because he was not instructed by the tenant. And he did not hear the tenant's instruction. He was instructed by a third party who had no right, absolutely no right then and no right since, to have any communication with that licensed law trader in the name of or on behalf of the tenant. And there was a transcript of the phone call. There was a transcript of the phone call that was made by the tenant, who never gave any permission to anyone to do a transcription of that, because the idea was that the call would be played in the court, not the transcript. And the transcript was wrongly done anyway. So when the so-called transcript was allegedly referred to by Judith Goodman, she made it even worse than even the wrong transcript version was. And then she said that that is why she was justified in rejecting the appeal and upholding the eviction. Now, all this information that you are looking at, think about the facts. Obviously, you are not a party to this, but you can think about the facts and you can see just how very different, how extensively different evictions can be from the image of rent arrears. Rent arrears are, compared to this kind of conspiracy done by all the parties involved in the so-called process, rent arrears are nothing. Now, the party that was targeted by the eviction attack lost their life's work. And the life's work constitutes, as some of the previous items broadcast by referring to this would support, substantiate, and remind you of, life's work, original work, investigative work, legal work, work that spans decades, work that cannot be replicated anywhere else, and work that includes original compositions, translations, analysis, and stored images, pictures, sounds, and other evidence that affect rights of millions of people across the country and across the world. So therefore, the damage that they did, those criminals, damaged not only the housing rights of the particular target, but the rights, many rights, not just housing, including housing rights of millions of people across the world, and other rights, many, many rights. So therefore, the Guardian should at least have left open the possibility that evictions are far more complex and far more damaging and detrimental to the person targeted for eviction than the sheer mention of eviction and rent arrears imply. And so we shall be talking more about the details of the damages and the details of the illegality by Judith Goodman, Henrietta Manners, Edward Fitzpatrick, Lucy Green, and the other complicit colluders and criminals, and all of them racists. One degree or another, all of them were racists and are racists and remain racists. And Mike Tyrrell. We shall be continuing this in the next part. This is coming to 1:45 GMT in the afternoon of Monday, the 21st of September 2020. The day that the attacks through the rubber stamping courts, attacks via the rubber stamping county courts in England on people's homes and housing rights are being revived by the Johnson-fronted government, where the minister is a bribery conduit. He's a source of bribery by the multi-billionaire, porn multi-billionaire, Dirty Desmond of the Conservative Party, where the housing violations are being now constructed by the porn billionaire Richard Desmond for luxury housing project in the West Ferry Road in the Isle of Dogs in Tower Hamlets, and excluding access by the people in need, local people, low-income people, to housing rights and amenities. So we shall be continuing this examination. This is just past 1:45 GMT in the afternoon of Monday, 21st of September 2020.